Always a pleasure to be here on the Reclamation Project with everybody today. Something very, very, I think, helpful to a lot of people. All right, well, here we go. Well, today what we're gonna talk about is, like I said, something very important. We're gonna talk about the subject of disappointment and how to deal with disappointment. When you look at today's world, we are surrounded by disappointment, whether that be disappointment in not getting a job or a financial opportunity that you had hoped for, whether that be disappointment in not being able to create a relationship with somebody that you had eyes for, or whether that be a disappointment in that your preferred political candidate did not get into office, or whatever that looks like. Disappointment that your children did not turn out the way that you had hoped. Disappointment that your marriage dissolved into divorce. There are so many forms of disappointment in this world. And what we find is that increasingly people are becoming less and less able to deal with disappointment in an effective way. Now, in the past, when people did not have the tools to deal with disappointment, oftentimes they would do what we call self medicating. And what that means is they would find some sort of stimuli, some sort of intoxicant that would temporarily take away the pain of the disappointment. And most conventionally, most commonly, we know these forms of self medication to be things like alcohol or drugs. And today, people still do that, whether it be alcohol, drugs, food, TV, sex, whatever it may be. People will still use these things as a way to manage the pain of disappointment as opposed to finding a healthier way. However, there are even more insidious ways that people deal with disappointment, and sometimes they don't use the illegal drugs or things like that or alcohol. They use legal prescription medications to deal with drugs, and I believe that there are some people who really do need prescription medication, absolutely. But I believe that there are a lot of people in this world who are on prescription medications that don't really need to be. They just need effective tools for handling disappointment. And if we could arm them with these tools, maybe they could get away from the Paxil and the Lexapro and things like that. So, what we're going to do is we're going to look at dealing with disappointment in a healthy way. And these are all suggestions. What I invite you to do is I invite you to write these things, these suggestions down, look them up, study them for yourself. And if you find that some of these might be useful, try and apply them to your own life. So there's an article by a doctor. His name is Michael Ashworth, and it's literally called Dealing with Disappointment. And he talks about in the article the reasons why we must deal with disappointment in a healthy way, because there are some real potential negative ramifications of disappointment. He says people who are disappointed are at greater risk of physical or emotional difficulties or both. Such individuals appear to have a greater frequency of, now tell me if this sounds familiar, headaches, gastrointestinal difficulties, moist palms, overperspiration than those scoring low on the scale. For some, being very disappointed for prolonged periods of time can lead to chronic stress problems. So, what is he talking about? People who constantly have headaches. You ever met somebody who's always asking for aspirin or ibuprofen or Advil or something like that because they've always got a headache? I know a lot of ladies deal with that. They're constantly having headaches and dealing with stress, and it's not just because their husbands drive them crazy, but it's because women they tend to worry a lot, and this is not something that's exclusive to women, of course, but women tend to worry a lot, and so you constantly hear them getting headaches and looking for something to try and alleviate that pain. And then you have the gastrointestinal difficulties. A lot of times when people are in pain, they're struggling with disappointment. Their stomach hurts, right? It's just a kind of a physical reaction. Even if you have faith, you believe that this is going to work out, sometimes your body just reacts, to this painful situation that you're in. And you'll find people that have a lot of stomach issues when they're dealing with disappointment. And so some of the other things they mentioned as well. But one of the things that I thought was important was the very last sentence where he said, for some, being very disappointed for prolonged periods of time can lead to chronic stress problems. And chronic stress problems, I know a lot of people that have mystery ailments. They've gone to the doctor, they've done a battery of tests, they've done everything that you could do, and the doctor knows something is wrong, but cannot tell them what's wrong. That's because their issue is not related to a dietary thing or a lifestyle thing per se, or any physical thing that they could point to. It's linked to stress. And when you have illnesses and pains and things like that that are related to stress, it's really hard for doctors to figure out what that is. And ultimately, if this stress is allowed to continue on unchecked, that could lead to long-term chronic illnesses like cancer, and we know where those things can lead. So it's very important that we understand that not only do we have to understand disappointment, but we have to understand how to deal with disappointment in a healthy way so that we can overcome it and be and live an abundant life, and not live a dwarfed experience, live life to the fullest and fulfill our potential. One of the things that I love about the Bible is that it always has so much wisdom. And I always offer this up because I know that there are some people who may not be believers who are watching this. And what I invite people who are not believers to do is I invite them to read the Bible for yourselves without any of the preconceived ideas about the Bible, without any of the preconceived ideas about Christians, because unfortunately there are a lot of people who are Christians in name only. But look at the Bible and dive into it, because there's some really interesting wisdom in there that really coincides with current day science very well. One of those things is found in the book of Proverbs, chapter 15:13, and it says, "A merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance, but by sorrow of the heart the spirit is broken." So what does that tell you? It says a merry heart make it. Look, if you are happy, if you are at peace, you're going to feel good. You're going to be thriving, whether it's emotionally, physically, and in so many different ways. But sorrow of the heart, usually it comes from some sort of pain, some sort of disappointment that can lead to a broken spirit, which can then lead to a broken body, and that could ultimately lead to an early grave. So it's really important that we understand this stuff, and that we get it under control. Um, Dr. Michael Ashworth, he continues and he says, disappointment results from thoughts and expectations being out of line with reality. So this is really interesting, because a lot of times what we try to do is, we as human beings try to order our lives in such a way so as to avoid any and all discomfort, pain, and any sort of thing that is just undesirable, and that wouldn't be fun. We just try to order our lives in such a way as to avoid all of those things. And sometimes what we have to remember is that disappointment is a part of life. Things are not always going to go the way that we had hoped. despite our best efforts. Even if we try, we're responsible, we go to school, we get the good job, we marry the quote unquote right person, we have the kids, we have the perfect little life on the outside, things are supposed to go a certain way, and then all of a sudden, they don't. They don't. And we become incredibly disappointed and sometimes incredibly depressed because we think, hey, we've done all the right things, things should be a certain way, and that's just not life. So disappointment often results when our thoughts and expectations are out of line with reality. Or let's just take it in another more simple example. So, for example, um, and I don't mean to pick on the ladies, but let me just give you this example. One thing that women, bless their hearts, are notorious for is expecting their husbands, their spouses, whomever, to be able to read their minds, to just know what it is that they need in that particular moment, to know what it is that they're feeling in that moment, and to respond to that without them having to say anything. And they feel that way because if you love me, you should know, right? But that's not always the case because men, us men, admittedly, can be a bit dense. And when men are oftentimes monotaskers, we get involved in something and we get sucked in, and that's what we're doing. Whether it's working on something in the garage, or whether it's watching a game, or whatever it may be, men, we just kind of tunnel vision, right? And so oftentimes, if we don't see, if we don't recognize that, the wife is cleaning up and maybe she's tired and she wants a little help. But we're sucked into the game. It's the fourth quarter. Your team is down by 3 points, and you're just right there in that moment, not realizing what it is that's going on. And all of a sudden, she might get a little upset because she expects you to be able to see. You should know that she needs something, right? So I guess what I'm trying to show is an example of how that's not realistic, right? Nobody can read your mind. If you need something, you need to speak up and say, I'm really tired, I could use some help, do you think you could stop for a few minutes and help me? Now, in that case, you have a realistic expectation of receiving help. But if you don't say anything, that is an unrealistic expectation. But if you expect people to just feel, that just have like a sixth sense of when you need something and you don't get it, then you become angry and disappointed because your expectation was out of line with reality. So that's just one example. There are many examples that I could get. Like I said, I don't mean to pick on the ladies, but that was just one thing that came to the top of my head. Um, he also continues and he says, your expectations and hopes for others may be too high for the situation at hand. Even if you think your expectations are appropriate and realistic, they may not be realistic at all. So, another example is many parents tend to be helicopter parents, and maybe they've gone through some tough things. Maybe they made some bad choices growing up, or maybe they came from another country where things were a lot more difficult, and so they want their kids to not struggle the way that they did, and so they kind of plan out, in their mind, the way their children's lives should go. And the expectation is that they're going to be good parents, great parents, are going to make sure they always do their homework, always study for the test, always get good grades, always graduate, always go to the good school, and things like that. And the kid is just supposed to trust the wisdom of the adult. And there is wisdom, wisdom in the older folks, right? But the kids, they don't always understand that until they get older sometimes. But what adults expect is for us to just trust them unquestioningly and to do what they say. And there comes a clash sometimes, because sometimes, you may have an idea for your child and in a way that you would want them to go, and they're wired a little differently. Might want little Susie, to be a doctor, but little Susie doesn't have any desire to be a doctor. She wants to be a musician. She loves music and she loves playing the piano or whatever it may be. You want little Susie to be a dentist or a lawyer, and little Susie wants to go to art school and become an artist. And so a lot of times this happens. And in fact, I have one particular friend who tried for 18 years to be, super mom, and did everything within her power, even, foregoing, meeting somebody else and possibly, finding a life partner. And all her energy was going to be put into making her daughter, helping her daughter become a doctor, right? And, you know, when the daughter went to college, she kind of went off the rails, and the disappointment in her was palpable. She went through an incredible time of depression because her daughter decided to do something different than what she wanted. But here's what happens: her she thought her expectations were appropriate and realistic, but they weren't really realistic at all, because that was her dream. That's what she wanted her daughter to be. That's not what her daughter wanted to be. And so, because her expectations and expectations and hopes and dreams, even though they were appropriate, like it would have been great if the daughter was a doctor, she wasn't. And because they weren't realistic, um, and the daughter went in a totally different direction, that led to severe disappointment and ultimately depression. And she ended up on, medication and things like that. And it was a very sad scene altogether. The relationship between her and the daughter was strained. And so those are the kind of things that happens. That's what, Ashworth is talking about. He continues and he says, one solution is to change your expectations to more realistic levels. Some disappointments are actually predictable and preventable. Did you hear that? He said some disappointments are actually predictable and preventable. Like, look, if you expect your kid to be perfect all throughout school, never make any mistakes, never do anything stupid, never question you, never argue, just do exactly what you want, what you want them to do, like little automatons, and get straight A's all the way throughout school and graduate with honors and go to medical school and be a world-class doctor. I mean, maybe the best thing to do is lower those expectations a little bit and give them the grace and space to grow and fulfill the path that God wants them to fill, whatever that looks like. Um, because if you have such high expectations, it's pretty predictable that you're going to be disappointed. So to prevent that, lower your expectations. It's not saying that you shouldn't have any hopes for your child or for your life or for your marriage or whatever, but it is saying that you have to understand that not everything is going to be the way that you think it should be. Not everything is going to be perfect. In fact, nothing is going to be perfect, especially human beings, because the only thing that a human being is going to do perfectly is disappoint you. Period. Okay? And life is not fair. You could be a good person. You could do all the quote unquote right things. You could take all the safest roads in life. And guess what? Life could turn out totally the opposite of what you had hoped it would be, because life is not fair. We were never promised that life would be fair. Okay? So, by changing those expectations and lowering those expectations from unrealistic to realistic, you can prevent disappointment that is rather predictable with the unrealistic expectations. Um, Michael Ashworth said, it is important to differentiate between realistic and unrealistic expectations so that you can respond appropriately. Repeated disappointment may be the result. Listen to this. Repeated disappointment. If you're disappointed over and over, what he's saying is that may actually be the result of a pattern of faulty or irrational thinking. So for the wife who was angry because the husband wouldn't read her mind, well, guess what? She's disappointed in that particular moment because her thinking is faulty. It's irrational. Nobody can read your mind except God, right? Your husband, as well as he may know you, and hopefully he'll know you better than anybody on this earth, still is not going to be able to read your mind. So the thinking was faulty or irrational. And if she just spoke up and asked for help directly and audibly, then she very well may have gotten that help. For the example of my friend who whose daughter, had the expectations that her daughter was going to become, this, doctor and this amazing, student and this and that, and that didn't happen. You know, what she failed to realize was that she never really asked the daughter, what do you want to be, what do you enjoy. It was more like, no, this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to be, because this is the right way. So that was faulty or irrational thinking, and that's what the cause of the disappointment was. Okay. um, Ashworth says, if you are frequently disappointed, evaluate what you are thinking. Now, because here's the thing: we get disappointed and we always think it's something wrong with the other person. How many times do you see a spouse drag the other spouse to marriage counseling in the hopes that the marriage counselor will not be able to help them work together better and communicate better, but will talk some sense into the other spouse, so the other spouse will act right and start doing what the other spouse wanted them to do? How often does that happen? Going back to the example of my friend and her daughter, she started going to therapy, and and her expectation was, hopefully I'm paying all this money and the therapist can talk some sense into my daughter, and my daughter will listen to me and start doing the things that I said. But you know what? What ended up happening? What ended up happening was the therapist basically told my friend, you have to stop trying to live vicariously through your daughter. You have to stop being a helicopter mom, and you have to let her grow. She's an individual. And you know what happened after that? She stopped therapy immediately. That was the last session they ever had. So, oftentimes, we think we're disappointed because it's other people's fault and other people need to change. But sometimes the problem is you. Sometimes the problem is your irrational and faulty thinking, and you are responsible for your own disappointment because you have these bizarre, unrealistic expectations that nobody can ever meet. And that's what happens a lot, and that's where breakdowns happen in relationships, and that's where we start to get bitter because why can't they just do, what I'm asking is not, inappropriate, but it may be unrealistic. It may be unrealistic, and it may just be a problem. Um, and Brother Melvin says we can set ourselves up for frustration and disappointment with unrealistic expectations. Absolutely, absolutely. That's oftentimes where it comes from. I mean, we think about, for example, in so many examples. This is what I love about the Bible. For those of you who are unbelievers, it kind of, there's so many examples and stories in the Bible that highlight this. And one that comes to mind is, for example, the book of Jonah, right? Jonah, God asked Jonah to go to this very wicked city called Nineveh and preach to the people for 40 days because God was going to destroy them for their sins. And Jonah thought, hey man, if I don't preach to them, God will destroy them, because he hated Nineveh. And obviously, Jonah tried to go in the opposite direction. That didn't work out well. He ended up being thrown into the sea and swallowed up by a very big fish and spit out onto the shore right where Nineveh was. And he went and he preached to the Ninevites, and lo and behold, they changed and they repented, and God didn't destroy them. And Jonah was so disappointed. Okay, so I had a question about whether a sense of inadequacy was in any way tied to disappointment. Um, and one of the things that I was saying was that oftentimes when we feel a sense of low self-worth, low self-esteem, where we feel inadequate, oftentimes we look for validation from other things, other sources, other people, from our achievements. And unfortunately, more often than not, we may not receive the validation that we're looking for, or we may not receive the sense of fulfillment or the sense of self-worth from achieving these certain things, and the ultimate result is going to be disappointment. And so when we're looking for other people, other things, and accomplishments to validate us, we will most often end up being disappointed, and then that could lead to self-medication and things like that. So in some ways, yeah, having a sense of low self-worth and inadequacy can often lead to disappointment. um, again, like I was saying, a man's heart, deviseth his way, but the Lord ordereth his steps, directeth his steps, and that's why God doesn't always allow our plans to come to fruition, because we sometimes don't know what we don't know. God knows us better than we know ourselves, but the problem is that when we get angry because we're disappointed, oftentimes we become angry with God, even though some of us won't admit it, right? This is what happened with Jonah, okay? And we rationalize, hey, I work hard, I've been good, I haven't cheated anybody, I haven't slept with anybody's spouse, or I haven't killed anybody. So, why won't God just give me what I want? And it's because God often knows what we need more than we do. And frankly, God is not Santa Claus, right? We always, this is why I personally don't like the idea of Santa Claus, because it teaches little kids that if you're good, you'll get good things, and if you're bad, you'll get a lump of coal. And that's not how life works, because sometimes good things happen to monsters and bad things happen to good people. So, if you have an idea like that, then you're going to be very disappointed in life if you're a good person and life doesn't work out exactly the way that you had hoped it would. Um, and the Bible also tells us something very different. When you look at Jeremiah 29:11, it says, "For I know the thoughts that you think that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end." So in the Bible, it tells us that God doesn't have any wicked desires for us. He's not trying to hurt us. He's not waiting to smite us, right? And the book of Romans 8:28, it says that all things work together for good for them that love God, and to them who are called according to his purpose. Okay? So what does that mean? That means that no matter what happens, whether you're super happy and exultant, whether you're disappointed, all those things eventually are going to work out and turn into a blessing. Whether you are a believer or not, we can all look back at experiences that we've had in life that we thought absolutely stunk. Like we had wanted no parts of that experience, and yet we had to go through it. And on the backside of that, there was a blessing. Right? There was growth. There was wisdom. There was something that came from that experience that helped us become who we are today. If we handled it right. If we handled it right. Because many times people don't handle it right, and they end up in the quagmire of self-medication and depression and all those things. And when you get into that trap, it's like quicksand. Um, Another thing to think about if you find yourself frequently disappointed, um, is that unrealistic expectations of other people, um, can and you could be having unrealistic expectations of other people, and you're allowing your happiness to be determined by whether or not people behave in a way that you think they should. Now think about that for a second. To allow your peace, your joy, and your happiness to be determined by whether or not the people around you act like you think they should, talk about a recipe for disaster. I mean, woof, that's setting yourself up for failure. Um, because if there's one thing that will never happen, is that people around you will never behave and act and think exactly how you think they should. Because sometimes people have different ideas about how their lives should go, and we have to be accepting of that. Now, if your happiness and your peace and your joy is found in something else, well, now you're talking. But as soon as your happiness is tied to the behavior of other people, you're setting yourself up for a serious failure. Um, and a good example of that is go to the book of First Samuel. book of First Samuel, you look at the story of David and Abigail, right? So David was on the run from Saul. Saul was the king at the time. Saul wanted to kill David. David had about 600 loyal men, and they were on the run from Saul. They were running very low on supplies, and David needed to do something so that they could replenish their supplies and keep moving. So he decided to watch over the shepherds and the flocks of a rich man by the name of Nabal, who was married to a very beautiful woman named Abigail. It was very common in those days for bandits and thieves to come and kill shepherds and take sheep, and I mean it was just kind of an expected thing, kind of like how people in San Francisco go into Walgreens and just steal hundreds of dollars worth of things. It was just kind of, they just knew that was coming, and so that was just kind of built into their profit and loss statements, I guess, if you will, at the end of the harvest, the wool harvest. But in this case, Nabal had David. David and his men watched over those flocks. They didn't lose one sheep, not one. And what happened was, when it came time for the wool harvest, Nabal had a bigger harvest than he had ever had before in the history of him doing business. And that meant more money for Nabal. So David was hoping that Nabal would see this and that he would then feel benevolent, and he would reciprocate by giving David and his men some supplies so that they could move forward. Well, Nabal didn't do that. In fact, he told David to go and take a long walk off of a short bridge, essentially. And David lost his mind. He became so angry that this God-fearing good man was ready to go murder Nabal and every single man that lived in his house, all because somebody didn't act the way that he thought they should. See, when your happiness is tied to the behavior of other people, you are going to find yourself disappointed a lot. And that's really silly. Your happiness should never come from the actions of other people. Look, if other people do act in a way that makes you happy, that's icing on the cake. But your peace, your joy, that should come ultimately from within, from God. Right? If you have God living inside your heart, that's where that source of peace should come from, and it shouldn't be tied to external sources. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. So here's the other thing. Oftentimes we become disappointed, and we will cast aside what we know to be right in order to get our way, because we feel like the ends justify the means. That never works out. Anytime you cast aside what you know to be right to get your way, to avoid disappointment, you're going to end up being disappointed, because the whole mantra that ends justify the means is very wicked. Right is right, period. Okay? And no amount of rationalization can change what is right and what is moral and what is good. And when you do what's evil to get a good, quote unquote, good thing in order to do a good thing, you end up um, oftentimes sad and disappointed. If you look at the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, as a matter of fact, the book of Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon at the end of his life, after he had made a bunch of really bad mistakes and spent his life doing some really awful things. And when he looked at, back at the end of his life, he wrote this very sad book called Ecclesiastes. And he says in chapter 2, verse 10, he says, "Whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them." Basically, he got whatever his heart wanted. "I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works of my hands had wrought, and the labor and that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, for there was no profit under the sun." In other words, Solomon thought, hey, the ends justifies the means. I, I understand God has a way, and God tells us not to do certain things a certain way, right? but I need this thing here. And so I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to sidestep God's will, and I'm going to go ahead and do this. And what he realized was that, look, I did that, I got this, and I realized that that wasn't worth it. I would have been much happier had I just gone down that path. And, for those of you who are not believers, I mean, if you just look at it from a secular perspective, when you try to sidestep morality, when you try to sidestep what you know to be right, right? And you set aside your integrity to go after a certain thing, oftentimes you end up very sad and very miserable when you think about what you had to do to get where you are. Why are so many celebrities, stars, wealthy people, why are they so miserable? And why are they all on drugs and caught up in like these very bizarre and strange lifestyles, trying to self-medicate? It's because they cannot stand to deal with the choices that they made to get where they've gotten. You see, I can go into it deeper, but I'm not going to go into it deeper. If you want to go into it deeper, you can. But let's just say a whole lot of people in positions of power, wealth, and fame have done some very awful things in order to get where they are, and they have trouble sleeping at night. And so that's where they resort to drugs and all sorts of promiscuous, strange lifestyle behaviors and things like that. And I won't go into that any further. Um, but you might say, well, my life stinks. Okay, my life stinks. Nothing that I ever want happens. I'm always disappointed. I'm always going through some sort of misery. And if somebody like the Apostle Paul, for example, were to hear you say that, he would be like, "Really, really, you gonna complain to me?" I mean, when you look at his life, man, he laid it out in 2 Corinthians 11, and he talks about all the bad things that he had gone through. You know, he talks about, being near death so many times, being beaten, whipped so many times, being shipwrecked, stoned. I mean, just constantly, being the victim of haters and liars. And just his life was just constant disappointment and pain and suffering. And yet, that man never, ever, ever turned his back on God. He never allowed his disappointments to turn into depression and destroy him. In fact, he said one of the most powerful things in the whole Bible in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 and 8, where he says, "Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God that passeth all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus." In other words, he says, look, man, don't worry about anything. Don't worry about anything, but through prayer and supplication and thanksgiving, bring your concerns, your worries, your cares to God, and He'll take care of the rest. And in exchange, He'll give you peace that is so powerful that the world won't even understand it. That's what Paul was able to say in the face of disappointment, because he learned how to handle disappointment the right way. So let me give you some quick ideas about um, handling disappointment. Okay. Um, First thing is learn from your defeats. Okay. Disappointment, failures, those are a part of life. They're an inevitable part of life. Okay. And what they do is they build character and they build patience when they're allowed to do so. Okay. They can teach us to win and lose with grace, which is kind of a lost art these days, if you know what I mean. Um, Another thing that you can do is you can build positive friendships, right? Um, God will often minister to us when we're in pain through other people. So, it can be very tempting to isolate ourselves when we're dealing with disappointment and pain. Like, I know people that will shut their phones off. They will I know they're going through something and I'm trying to call them to check up on them, and they will send me the voicemail every time because they don't want to talk, right? Instead, what we should be doing is, when we're feeling vulnerable, when we're feeling disappointed, we should be surrounding ourselves with positive friends who can help carry us through the disappointment and give us another perspective. You know, the other thing that we can do is not to focus on the disappointment, but focus on hope for the future. As long as you have breath in your body, there's an opportunity to make your situation better. Period. Um, in fact, there's a little story that I like, and it goes like this. Um, Somebody was a little frustrated and said, and was having a conversation with God, and said, "God, can I ask you a question?" And God said, "Sure." And the person said, "Promise you won't get mad." And God said, "Okay, I promise." And they said, "Why did you let so much stuff happen to me today?" And God said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you know, I woke up late." God said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, my car took forever to start." And God said, "Okay." And he said, "Well, at lunch, they made my sandwich wrong, and I had to wait, you know, for them to make it all over again. And I was late to get back to work." And God says, "Mm-hmm." And then he says, "And on the way home, my phone went dead, you know, because I forgot to charge my battery just as I was about to pick up a phone call." And God says, "All right." Person says, and on top of all that, when I got home, I just wanted to soak my feet in my brand new massager and relax, but it wouldn't work. Nothing went right today. It was a terrible day. Why did you do that?" And God said this. He says, "Well, let me see. Uh, the death angel was by this morning, and I had to send one of my angels to battle him for your life, and I kind of let you sleep through that." And the person says, "Oh." God says, "I didn't start your car because there was a drunk driver on your normal route that would have hit you if you were on your road." And the person goes, "I see." And God says, "The first person who made your sandwich today was sick, and I didn't want you to catch what they had because I knew you couldn't afford to miss work. So I had them mess your sandwich up so somebody else could redo it." And the person says, "Okay." And God says, "Oh, and the foot massager? Well, it actually had a shortage that was going to throw out all the power in your house tonight, and I didn't think you wanted to be in the dark." And the person says, "I'm sorry, God." And God says, "Don't be sorry. Just learn to trust me in all things, in the good and the bad." And the person says, I will trust you." And God says, "And don't doubt my plan for your day, that my plan for your day is always better than your plan." And the person says, "I won't, God. And let me just tell you, thank you for everything that you did today." And God says, "You're welcome, child. It's just another day being your God, and I love looking after my children." So, in other words, what are we trying to say? Sometimes when things happen that are disappointing to us and life doesn't go according to our plans, it's because there's something that we were prevented from experiencing that we shouldn't have experienced, or something that we needed to experience to help us grow and become better people. But no matter how you slice it, disappointment can always be spun into something positive if we handle it in the right way, if we maintain a positive attitude, if we don't focus on the disappointments but focus on hope for the future, if we surround ourselves with positive friends, and if we are determined not to let any of this stuff keep us down, but to keep going forward in faith, trusting that tomorrow can be better than today. So we're doing something a little different today. Apparently, we now have time for a little Q&A. And I so far we haven't had much Q&A in the Reclamation Project. So if you all have any questions, I would love you to throw your questions out there and answer your questions live right here, right now. So if there's any questions, I say ask away. What do we got, Brother Stan? It has quieted down. Okay. All right. Well, um, on that note, well, I hope you all got something out of the discussion today. You know, disappointment, it's a real serious thing, and we all struggle with disappointment on some level. And but I want you all to know that whether you are going through something currently or whether you're going to go through something, if you handle it the right way, you can come out on the other side of that disappointment a stronger, wiser, better person than you were before that pain and disappointment. So I really hope that you guys are all blessed by this. I hope that this talk helps you really rethink how you look at your disappointments, and I hope that you're able to handle them in a more graceful, positive way going forward. Until next time, take care, folks.